very rarely is it the case that a group of people say, why don't we get that disgruntled ex-Marine who's been trying to defect to Cuba, get him to kill the president, and then get a strip club owner to kill him? This sounds like a solid plan, guys. They want to silence me, Freddy. They're trying to silence me, but I will not be silenced.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Natasha Feroze and this is our weekly omnibus. Before we get started, I just want to point you in the direction of our magazine this week. Our writer Paul Wood looks at power players, including Xi Jinping, Trump, Putin, all these authoritarian regimes who seem to be taking over the world right now. And he writes about a little bit about their history, their past, and what it could mean for us over here. I also want to implore our viewers to visit the Spectator shop, which is open through our YouTube channel. If you click down below, there's a description, and we're selling caps, we're selling jigsaws, diaries, notepads. They make great birthday and Christmas presents. So please do visit our shop. Moving on to the week. First up, we have Douglas Murray with Freddy Gray this week, who discussed why conspiracy theories just won't die.
Now, Douglas, you're not a conspiracy theorist at all. It seems when it comes to the JFK assassination and the recently released CIA files, all 63,000 pages of documents, have not persuaded you otherwise.
Well, first of all, no, I'm not a conspiracy theorist in general. Although, as I say in the column, I mean, we do live in an era of conspiracy thinking, for sure, which the internet, multimedia, and much more of just social media have managed to metastasize as a tendency. But as I say in the column, one of the problems about conspiracy theories in our own day, as always, is that some things get called conspiracy theories that actually turn out to be what we used to call true. And that's definitely something that people notice. But no, when it comes to the JFK assassination, I've always thought this is one of those cases like the death of Princess Diana, where you get a whole industry of people who essentially can't cope with or don't want to cope with the randomness of life and the precariousness of life, even of the world's most famous people, and come up with very elaborate and interesting theories about what has happened. And with the JFK files, we've been told for years that there would be stuff that had been held back and that it would be a real zinger when we learned about it. And since President Trump's order to release the remaining files on the assassination of President Kennedy, we now know almost exactly what the Dallas police knew within a few hours of the shooting 50 years ago. And that's already disappointing some people. And as I say in the piece, you can never kill conspiracy theories because they are by nature self-reinforcing. If the evidence isn't there, it means that there is evidence that's being kept from you still.
And conspiracy theories tend to gravitate towards the Jews, and certainly with the JFK assassination attempt, before in the sort of drumbeat in the build-up to the release of these files, there was a lot of talk online and elsewhere in print, in some places in print, about the fact that Mossad may have been involved in the assassination of JFK, that it has something to do with Israel acquiring nuclear weapons. What did you make of that? Did you just think that was typical Israel hatred?
Well, that's sort of corners of the internet who will always go there. I noticed that the very day that the files were released, when nobody would have had time to go through even a fraction of the documents, various online figures were immediately doing live chats, saying things like, Mossad, the CIA, and JFK assassination. There's a reason for that, which is that if you do that, you will get quite a lot of people coming to your chat. Whereas if you say, with all due respect, guys, I'm going to read through all of these documents or even a portion of them, and then I'll report back, you're not people don't want to watch people reading documents live and poring over them and working out what's not been redacted and what has. That's much more boring, much more exciting, much more stimulating, much more grabbing to people's attention is trying to allege that there's some conspiracy that's been revealed, which in fact has not. It's not just, I mean, there's so many theories and always have been about the assassination of JFK. And as I mentioned in the piece, one of the things that has happened with it over the years is something which I've always found very interesting about genuine conspiracy theories in general, which is you can not only never dampen them down, but there are certain techniques that conspiracy theorists get hooked onto. For instance, they will claim that there's no way that somebody could have fired the shots from the distance that Lee Harvey Oswald was at in the book depository and hit the president. People will claim things like, I know he was in the Marine Corps, but he wasn't that good. In fact,
the magic bullet, as it's called.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, as we know, Lee Harvey Oswald was actually, when he was in the Marine Corps, reckoned to be a pretty good sharpshooter. And the distance from which he shot and indeed killed the president was significantly shorter than the distance between the shot taken at President Trump in Butler last year. So, but that's a classic one. Conspiracy theories in general rely on this sort of thing. People who were doing conspiracy theories about the 7/7 attacks, for instance, on the London transport system, would always seize on things like, well, the train that the bombers were alleged to have been on was leaving Luton at 6:32 in the morning, and the 6:32 didn't leave. And anyone who's a normal person who's taking a moderate interest in it will be flummoxed because they're not an expert on Luton train timetables, and therefore they feel sort of as if they're being outfoxed. It's the same thing with 9/11 conspiracies. It's always that they will focus on details of the story, which they believe are the great tells. And in fact, very often, and certainly in the case of the JFK files, what they think are the very exciting missing facts aren't there. People will even now say things like, well, Lee Harvey Oswald didn't confess to the cameras when he was there before Jack Ruby killed him. And again, it's like, interestingly enough, human beings behave strangely, particularly people who've just shot the most famous person in the world.
Yes. I think what strikes me about the story is that obviously the CIA, these files were not released for a long time. And then when bits of them were, they were quite heavily redacted. And so that obviously feeds suspicion, and conspiracy theories feed off a lack of transparency. And there is also this very American obsession with classification and redaction, and it's a very American federal government thing. We've had lots of stories in the last few years that are to do with classified documents and to do with redaction. And a lot of people read conspiracy into it, where really I think it is just a sort of a particularly American fetish.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because in the case of the JFK files, and I sort of know this from a bit from speaking to people who are in Trump's first administration, the passages that were still redacted turn out to be things like the social security numbers of various people. So, in other words, the bit of the page that people are hoping says, and this is when LBJ said we've got to kill JFK, actually is just someone's social security number, which is rather boring. Certainly, if you're hoping that the great cathedral is going to fall down. In fact, the passages and the pages that have been redacted before in the JFK files significantly appear to be the CIA trying to make sure that their operational tactics, including following Lee Harvey Oswald, who of course tried to defect not just to Moscow, where he tried to kill himself, but also to Cuba, that they didn't want to know the techniques they were using to monitor him, and probably to some extent didn't want it to be known that he was on their radar and they missed him. And what's fascinating about that, for anyone interested in conspiracy theories, is that by doing that, inadvertently, the CIA massively increased the conspiracy theories about their own involvement. The people who have studied these things in the past have quite often, actually, as I understand it, given advice to the federal government and federal government agencies that this is precisely why they should be more upfront and less secretive about things, because the more that you do cover over a story, or the more you try to hide things and don't explain why you're hiding them, the more you fuel whole industries of people who will come up with explanations, including that the federal government did it. And that's always got a deep oddity about it. I mentioned in the piece, one of the people who's a serious position now in the Department of Health, heading the Department of Health, RFK Jr., has said in the past that he thinks the evidence is, quote, overwhelming that the CIA was involved in the murder of his uncle and indeed father. And there are lots of personal reasons, I'm sure, why he feels that. And I think there's lots of psychological reasons you can put onto it. But as I mentioned in the piece, I always thought that was rather odd in itself, because if I lived in a country where I believed that the authorities managed to kill not just my father, but also my uncle, I'd hot-footed out of that country quite fast. Yeah. And there's a lot of stuff in the ether. I agree with you to some extent. It's become an American thing, and I think this is in part, and it should be in the future, something that the government thinks about. I think it's in part because of the nature of holding information back and not explaining why. And then, just finally on that, I mean, I was very struck, and I say in the piece that, it's not like the conspiratorial mindset is onto nothing, because we have seen, for instance, just the news last week that Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, as early as early March 2020, told the British government, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, that it was almost certain that the COVID-19 virus had escaped from the lab in Wuhan that was working on creating precisely such viruses. So the British Prime Minister officials knew that, meant their American counterparts knew that. And throughout that era, everybody, including me, who was saying it seems more likely that the virus came from the lab that was working on exactly these viruses, was called a conspiracy theorist. And unless you believe that it was because of that the virus actually came from Chinese people eating bats, which itself was a rather more unpleasant explanation, actually, then you were some kind of conspiracy theorist. That has fallen apart only in 5 years. I mean, not that it needed 5 years, but the claim that the lab leak was a conspiracy theory has fallen apart in our time, in relatively short order. And it's inevitable that if you've seen that happen with one thing, you'll see it with others, and you'll believe that it's rife everywhere. And I don't think it follows that just because our governments covered up the origins of the COVID-19 virus, they also killed JFK, RFK, and almost everyone else.
Conspiracy theory thinking has got a lot more dramatic over the years. It's spread everywhere in the last 10 to 20 years. And as you say in your piece, a lot of people pin this down to the internet. But it's also something to do with living in a post-truth era, is it not? That now we don't really believe in anything, and so we'll believe in anything.
Yes, I think there's something in that. I hadn't heard post-truth for a while. That's a very Trump one.
Bringing it back.
Bring it back. Yes, there's a lot in that. I think that the internet era has, of course, sped this up, and it's in many ways for the good. I mean, it's good that a dump of documents that are unredacted can be put online, and anyone can read them. Sort of better in a way than that. They're released to the National Archives and some scholars pore over them and no one else see them. but at the same time, you have to be, in a way, mentally qualified to read these things. By which I mean, you have to know how to read a document critically. I mean, this is like something that school children get taught. But if you can't read the documents critically, and you're simply looking for the thing that you've decided to look for, you decided is there, and if you don't find it, evidence of it not being there is evidence that it is there, but it's being covered up. This is something that the age of the internet certainly is encouraging. People will say things like, "I've done my research," and you want to go, "Oh yeah," but in the end, it comes down to, as I say toward the end of the piece, I think it comes down to very often, and this is, nobody can be an expert on everything. None of us are. And the overwhelming amount of material and information that's out there on any story that happens is something which is clearly overwhelming for most people. A simple way to try to wade your way through that, without doubt, is to decide that there's a group of powerful people. They can be CIA, they can be the Jews. Lots of people are landing on that one again, as you mentioned. It can be almost anything that a conspiratorial mind will seize on a group of people who they believe are running the world. And as I mentioned in the piece, one of the things about this that is unpersuasive to me, at any rate, is the fact that those people seem to be unaware that the world isn't run like that. And that there is never the room in which, that if you see politics up close, as you and I have, and a lot of journalists have, you'll know that most politicking is people panicking to get on top of the thing that is happening a few hours before and failing to do so. And very rarely is it the case that a group of people say, why don't we get that disgruntled ex-Marine who's been trying to defect to Cuba, get him to kill the president, and then get a strip club owner to kill him? This sounds like a solid plan, guys.
Yeah. It sounds like the deep state are trying to hack into your room, Douglas.
I'm conscious of that, and I'm being wiretapped, as we say. That's because they don't want the truth to come out, Freddy Gray.
Well, let's get it out before they get to you. I think what you say about, I'm sure that's right, that people, it's a way of making sense of a very complicated and confusing world. But I wonder if it's also sort of more nihilistic than that in a way, because I often talk to people who are quite into conspiracy theories. I can be a bit into conspiracy theories myself, I must admit. And it's because it's more fun in a way. It's more,
yes.
It's more like a film than reality. And it can, you talked about people doing their own research. People love assembling facts together by themselves on the internet because it's entertaining.
Yes, I agree. There is a sort of obvious entertainment factor, and the idea that life or anything else will be explained, and it gives it a certain purpose. Yes, it's rather disturbing, isn't it, when you think about it, that a horrible killing of a president should end up with so many people navigating the nature of ballistic exit wounds and things like that, and sort of enjoying it, and much more. But yes, it's definitely much more interesting. I can already sense it from the column that I've written that some readers will be disappointed that I'm one of the people who's trying to stop the fun. Yeah. Their fun being the assassination of an American president.
Are there any popular conspiracy theories that are still considered conspiracy theories that you yourself buy or you're interested in?
Gosh, that's a good question. No, I mean, I'm interested in why people land on certain ones. And by the way, there's one that's fascinating to me, which is the growth of the moon landing conspiracy.
Oh yeah.
That is, and again, this is a very interesting and uniquely American one, which is that America manages to send astronauts to land on the moon. And then years later, other Americans decide they faked it and they didn't do it. the reason why I find the moon landing conspiracy absolutely fascinating, I don't buy it, but one of the reasons I find it absolutely fascinating is if you look at Soviet Russia, or indeed Russia today, they also send astronauts into space, but they're proud of it. And of course, the people who believe the Americans didn't land on the moon, you've got to say, well, do you think that the Soviets got up there? And like, was everyone fibbing about it? But what it really reveals is, in any normal, healthy society, the fact that your society had achieved something so extraordinary as landing on the moon would be something that you would celebrate. And Buzz Aldrin and the others would not be being defamed by their fellow Americans in the belief that instead of risking their lives to an incredibly dangerous and heroic mission, they actually were sort of sitting in a studio faking it. It points to something very interesting, which is and I find this particularly interesting when it happens on the American right, is that it actually hits on this nerve of we're not good as a country. We're not good. We didn't make it to the moon. We faked it in a studio.
Yeah.
But that's a pathology which is fascinating because it's very counter to the natural thing, which is I'm proud of my country. I'm proud we have done great things.
Yes. Well, do you think Americans are learning self-hatred? Because we Brits have been doing self-hatred for quite a lot longer. We're ahead of the game on that front.
Yes, I mean, I noticed you are particularly self-hating. I noticed, Freddie. I've always noticed that. No, I mean, the Americans are now leading the world in self-hatred. The British have been doing a pretty good job, but the Americans are certainly doing that. And now it's coming from the right as well as from the left. It used to only come from the political left. Now it's also coming from the political right. I find that very interesting and indeed disturbing because traditionally the conservative side was grateful for its inheritance and grateful and proud for the things that it had done that were good and pride worthy. So yes, it's a very interesting turn in America.
It's also a kind of reaction to being lied to, as you said earlier. It's what should be the journalist reaction, which is, why are these lying bastards lying to me? Should be the reporter's first reaction. But actually, as you hinted at earlier when you were talking about COVID, what a lot of the public can see is that there's a collusion between the media and political establishments, scientific establishments.
Absolutely.
When they need to convey a narrative. And a lot of people feel that they are being PR'd. They're not reading journalism.
And they're right.
And they're right. Exactly. Right. Yeah.
There are multiple publications that are completely dishonest in the way in which they report the news. And I mean, America is filled with such publications, papers and channels which say things that are put through a specific spin and a specific lens before they arrive on your breakfast table. And the interesting thing about that in recent years has been that the public in America in particular, they're really wise to that. They're really wised up to it. They know that what they're being told is being spun. And they're right, and there have been, I mean, how many years did MSNBC and others and senators and congressmen and newspapers of record like New York Times, how many years did they tell us that they were sitting on the evidence and it was going to come out any moment that President Trump was colluding with Russia? And that he'd been colluding with Russia to steal the 2020 election, the 2016 election.
That one's making a comeback at the moment, interestingly.
That is making a comeback.
Yeah.
But they told us 8 years ago that they were all over this and that it was imminent. At any moment. All the Rachel Maddows and everyone, night after night, and people would say, I've seen the files. And all the sort of knowing, nodding, pseudo knowledge of these people. And this is gonna kill me.
The bullet's about to come. Yeah,
I'm gonna be killed live on Spectator.
It'll do a lot of views.
But you've got to know who did it, and I'm about to tell you.
Where were we? Sorry, you
They
were saying...
want to silence me, Freddie. They're trying to silence me, but I will not be silenced.
The truth will come out. Sorry, carry on, Douglas. Where were you?
I can't.
We can't do it.
We should probably wrap.
Douglas Murray, it's always fascinating to talk to you, particularly about conspiracy theories, and we should resume this discussion at some point in the future, if they let us.
If they let us, so we're not silenced. Okay.
Thanks, Douglas.
Thank you, buddy.
Next, on to the protests in Turkey. Owen Matthews, our writer, and Hannah Lucinda Smith, a journalist in Istanbul, discussed why the political tensions continue to rise.
Hannah, I will start with you. You are in Istanbul. Give us a sense of the atmosphere.
Yeah, well, it's quite strange. I mean, it's very reminiscent of the Gezi Park protests of 2013 in that during the daytime, you go to Sultanahmet, the centre of Istanbul, and it's all quite normal, with tour groups being led around with flags. And then just around the corner, there's Saraçhane, the city hall of Istanbul, and you see the sort of mementos of the previous night's protests of spent rubber bullets, graffiti everywhere, rights law, justice, insults against Erdogan. And there's a few tents outside City Hall where the sort of hardcore protesters are staying overnight. And these protests are continuing. I mean, really, for the past decade, it's kind of felt like protest is dead in Turkey. It's not reported much in the international news anymore, but roundups are continuing, even against people who Erdogan accuses of being involved in organising Gezi 12 years on. Still roundups against people he accuses of being involved in the coup attempt. So there's been this whole atmosphere of fear in Turkey. And if there were protests, they petered out very quickly. They were overwhelmed by, riot cops very quickly. But this time they're continuing and they're carrying on. And I spoke with Ekrem İmamoğlu's foreign affairs advisor earlier in the week. And I asked him, did you expect this level of reaction inside Turkey? He said, we didn't. We knew there would be a reaction, particularly in Istanbul, but this level of reaction across the country. And when you look at the people who are coming out to protest, a lot of them actually are not particularly sort of Ekrem İmamoğlu fans or followers. Like you see a lot of people doing the grey wolf sign of the ultra-nationalists. They not necessarily people who would even vote for him, but they just feel that, democracy has been so blatantly pulled away from underneath them.
Tell us a bit about Ekrem İmamoğlu. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, but give us a sense of his popularity, where he is on the political spectrum, and why Erdogan has chosen now to move against him.
Well, the curious thing and the poetic thing is that in many ways, Ekrem İmamoğlu's career is mirroring Erdogan's exactly. Erdogan also rose to national prominence as mayor of Istanbul. He was put in prison while he was mayor of Istanbul and stripped of his office. Because at that time, the regime in Turkey was secularist. They clamped down very hard on anyone showing any kind of tendencies towards Islamist politics. And Erdogan used that time in prison as a massive kind of image polishing opportunity. He had a great team of spin doctors around him, really used that and came out as a hero. And within 4 years, he was prime minister of the country, and he's never left power as leader since. Ekrem İmamoğlu also in 2019, he almost came out of nowhere. He'd been mayor of a district called Beylikdüzü, which is right on the outskirts of Istanbul, kind of a new district. And he'd, sort of made a bit of a name for himself there. And then he was elected as the candidate in 2019 to stand in the local elections against Erdogan's candidate. Erdogan put up Binali Yildirim, who used to be prime minister, is extremely uncharismatic, and clearly thought that it was a shoo-in. The AKP or Erdogan's party had Istanbul for 25 years. And İmamoğlu took a surprise victory. Erdogan did everything he could to try and overturn it, but İmamoğlu clung on. He won a second term last year, even bigger victories, and for his party as well, extended victories across the country. And, in the past months, İmamoğlu has been launching himself onto a national stage because he's been preparing to become the candidate for the CHP in the next presidential election. So that's why Erdogan's moved now. He's seen in İmamoğlu something of himself when he was the rising upstart with all the headwinds behind him.
And Owen, in in your excellent piece this week, you make the point that Erdogan has never been stronger on the international stage and perhaps never been weaker at home. Talk to us first about why he's so strong at the moment on the international stage. It seems that Trump feels he needs him. A lot of Middle Eastern powers feel they need him. Russia feels they need him. How has he managed to get himself into this golden position abroad and this perilous position at home?
Yes, well, actually, one of the I lived in Istanbul for 15 years, and one of the Russian ambassadors visiting from Ankara said described Erdogan as the plug for every barrel, because in fact he is so crucial in so many different geopolitical configurations. He, from 2015, has essentially been horse trading, blackmailing is a little bit too strong a word, but certainly sort of reaping maximum benefit from Europe, because he's acted as a sort of as a bulwark against a sort of tide of immigration of people who are crossing the Aegean to Greek islands. He's reined that in. He's enormously important because he commands the biggest army in Europe. Or certainly in the European NATO, and the defense industry of Turkey is going to be playing a very important role in any kind of future European rearmament efforts. He's amazingly allies with Zelensky and friends with Putin. He's playing an enormously important role now in Syria. He's basically whatever one might say about his anti-democratic tendencies, Erdogan has always, throughout his entire career, been absolutely brilliant at sort of playing two sides against the middle. And right now, on the 17th, he had a conversation with Trump, the details of which were not released, but Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, described it as an excellent conversation, very constructive. And we know that the Turks... strange enough, Turkey is actually under some US sanctions still, because, or rather, measures have been taken by Washington to restrict Turkey's access to F-35, the F-35 program, for instance. There was some pushback from the United States, including some defense industry sanctions, when Turkey bought Russian air defense systems, and so on and so on. But the point is that Turkey is in a position, because of its strategic role in the Ukraine conflict, its strategic role vis-a-vis not just Syria but also Iraq and Iran, which it borders. So internationally, Erdogan has basically got a free ride on this. Compare and contrast to what the sort of opprobrium and sanctions and absolute moral indignation and outrage that was poured on, for instance, Alexander Lukashenko back in 2020, when he did a similar thing, cracked heads, put hundreds of put thousands of protesters in jail and so on. But no one really needs Lukashenko apart from Putin, of course. So far, the reaction has been pretty muted, both from Washington and Brussels. I mean, there have been European leaders that have spoken out, but spoken out. As yet, everyone needs Turkey too much to actually really do anything to rein him in terms of international diplomacy.
In fact, you could probably say he's the only world leader who has had a good relationship with Putin, has got on with Putin and accommodated Russian interests without being this pariah figure to the West. Yeah,
well, actually, I mean, it's very practical. Turkey signed up to zero sanctions. A large amount of Turkey's of Russia's oil is exported from Novorossiysk through the Bosphorus, the Turkish Straits, and there are two major gas pipelines which take Russian gas underneath the Black Sea, where it's then mixed with a little bit of Azeri gas and then sort of magically transformed. It's basically sort of gas laundering. then it's piped through Thrace into southern Europe. So and grain is also exported through the Turkish Straits. I mean, Turkey is an enormously important it's like it's a crucial cornerstone of all of Russia's exports, which are keeping Putin's war machine going. But at the same time, the Turks have also provided some very deadly technology. Particularly at the beginning of the war, you had the Bayraktar 2 drone, which was actually produced by a company owned by Erdogan's son-in-law. Son-in-law, yes, son-in-law, and it's extraordinary that he's managed to be such a close, not just political but practical friend of Putin, and indeed remain an ally of Zelensky, with whom he also a massive trading relationship. I mean, whatever one might think about Erdogan's democratic credentials, which are basically now in the bin, he is extraordinarily skilled on the international stage and continues to be.
And Hannah, is that partly because what Owen's saying there? Is that partly because Turkey is blessed by geography? It is a connecting point for various worlds, and as such is very important to all sorts of global interests.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's definitely been, dealt a great hand when it comes to Turkey's importance, but also don't underplay his own skill. He's very, very good at reading situations and acting pragmatically accordingly. And don't forget, he's in some ways quite an unsophisticated guy. I mean, he's not from a kind of elite family. He doesn't speak English. People I've spoken to who knew him when he kind of first rose to national power said that he used to be quite sort of unsure of himself on the international stage, and he would ask for quite detailed notes from his diplomats. And as time goes on, he doesn't do that anymore, perhaps unsurprisingly. But I think, like Trump, he's got great instincts, both domestically and, internationally. And we've seen him testing the waters, actually, with this. If you remember when the Ukraine conflict first started and Sweden and Finland wanted to join NATO, and Erdogan stalled it for, I think, more than a year in the end, right? Forced Sweden to change its constitution, and basically got what he wanted with no reprimands from anybody. So he's tested the water, he's got away with it, and now he's sensed that it's his moment to do it. And, he's been proved right.
Well, one thing he's not controlling very well domestically is the economy, which is having serious jitters at the moment. Can you give us an impression of how bad things are at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the key difference between now and 2013 when Gezi happened. When Gezi happened, there was a lot of pent-up frustration amongst the youth, particularly about Erdogan's sort of slide towards Islamism, more conservative politics, anti-democratic backsliding. But the economy was generally quite good and things were going quite well for Turkey. And the AKP and Erdogan's support base was still broad. Now, I mean, the economy is so bad. The inflation at some point, according to the official figures, was above 80%. Unofficially, some economists say it was much higher than that even. And even though they've brought it down a bit, it's still above 40%. Prices go up and up and up every day. People's wages are not keeping up with it, particularly if you don't have assets, if you don't own your house, if you don't have any stocks. I mean, it's just really becoming unlivable, particularly places like Istanbul. So there's that as well. And I think that's certainly contributed to why these protests have spread even to places like the Black Sea region, Erdogan's home region, Inner Anatolia, incredibly conservative AKP heartlands. You're seeing hundreds of people out in the streets. It's incredible.
Owen, I remember we had a conversation on here with Michael Weiss, I think it was a while ago, when the revolution happened in Syria. And I think it was Michael Weiss, not you, who described it as a catastrophic success for Turkey. Because they had been moving against Assad, they'd been trying to plot against Assad, but they didn't actually necessarily want Gilani to succeed, and they didn't necessarily want the situation. Has what's going on in Syria affected Erdogan's standing at home in Turkey?
Indirectly, because actually the most important thing that's one of the most important political projects that Erdogan has been undertaking is this sort of on-again, off-again sort of process of reconciliation with the largest Kurdish party, which is the essentially sort of the potential kingmaker and in any sort of future parliamentary deadlock. So that's really. That horse trading has always been has basically been ongoing for decades. But actually, I mean, the first real deal was really put together in 2016. So the good news is that sort of the insurgency in southeast Turkey, which literally saw the centers of various Turkish towns occupied by armed insurgents, and that was extraordinary. I mean, that is something that's really quite close to sort of state collapse when you have the center of Diyarbakir is you have armed rebels sort of in the center of town. That's all gone. That has now been authority has been reestablished. Ironically, the place in most the city centre that you're most likely to see Turkish-made armoured personnel carriers. It's a light infantry fighting vehicle called the Akrep. The Scorpion is actually in central Istanbul these days. Yeah, I've seen on Twitter, the police literally deploying in infantry fighting vehicles against their own citizens. So, but as Hannah rightly said, actually it's the economy that's actually the big change, because Putin and Erdogan are often compared, and there is one way in which they essentially share a sort of social contract, and that is that people are very only too willing to surrender their sort of democracy or their abstract sort of human rights and press freedom and so on in exchange for prosperity. And in Putin's case, he still actually managed to more or less sort of hang on to that social contract, and for various reasons we don't need to go into here. But for Erdogan, it's broken down. He no longer represents stability and no longer represents sort of economic competence. I mean, for a long time, and actually, unlike Putin, who's handed over economic control to one of the best central bankers in the world, Elvira Nabiullina. Erdogan, by contrast, has actually insisted on some really eccentric kind of borderline crazy fiscal policies over interest rates and so on, and exchange rates that actually have completely sort of deep sticks the economy, because of his basically unprofessional, hands-on control of macroeconomics. So he really actually is Erdogan's fault, and that I think is his biggest vulnerability. I mean, notionally, the next presidential elections don't have to be until 2028. But I wonder whether this. I'm sure Hannah has a more better founded view on whether those elections are going to be earlier or not. I can't really imagine Erdogan being able to put up with this level of political turmoil for 3 months, let alone 3 years.
And Hannah, about the turmoil, Erdogan has succeeded in clamping down previous efforts to remove him. Does he have control of the military at the moment, if they are needed? Will police forces be able to control the protests in Istanbul? How out of hand are things getting as far as he's concerned?
Actually, just speaking, I can hear in front of my flat the protest starting. It's just coming up to 8:30 in Istanbul, which is when people are called to the streets each night. Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? The Turkish police had never been shy of using non-lethal weapons or less lethal weapons. So, yeah, rubber bullets, tear gas. The level at which they've been using them this time is so much more intense than in Gezi. I mean, Gezi took sort of 3 weeks, people occupying Taksim Square until the police really sort of stormed in. But, the past 2 or 3 nights, you're literally seeing police with their own tear gas canisters in the face of protesters, firing rubber bullets at point blank range. Police numbers have been massively boosted here in Turkey, particularly since the coup attempt. And at the same time, the army, I mean, more than half of the top generals and admirals were fired from their positions after that coup attempt. Analysis suggests that basically it was a clear out of the more sort of European-looking officers, particularly those who'd spent time on NATO postings. I think about 90% of the officers who were on NATO postings on the night of that coup were dismissed, and a lot of them claimed asylum in Europe. So, yeah, I mean, and also the chain of command of the military was brought under the defense ministry as well after that coup attempt. So I think it's very, very unlikely that anything would come from the military against Erdogan, particularly, seeing the crackdown after the last coup attempt. On the other hand, I reported in Syria throughout the war as well, and I often sort of compare situations in my head and talk with friends and think, well, can you imagine a situation where the Turkish police might fire on protesters? And I can't imagine that. I off the record, I speak with plenty of police officers who are as dissatisfied as everyone else with the situation. And in fact, when you really study the videos, I was watching one last night. There was a police officer who was really going for it with the tear gas, and one of his colleagues came and pulled him off. Said, "What are you doing?" So there are, it's not Syria, but this is it's a tense moment. I'm not sure where this is going to go because it's been so long since we've had protests on this scale in Turkey.
And finally, a question for both of you. I'll start with Hannah. If a sort of brutal crackdown of this revolt ensues and the revolt looks even more seriously like it might remove Erdogan from power, what do you anticipate Western powers will do?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, at the moment, it's been pretty much silence. Interestingly, a lot of mayors from across Europe have lent their support to Imamoglu. One of the things that he's done in office is he's sort of done this outreach to other opposition mayors in, countries around Europe that are backsliding democratically, and he's sort of really built this network. So we're seeing a lot of condemnation come from them. But I think, the longer this carries on and, especially if the kind of brutality of the crackdown increases, and especially if Erdogan keeps on with the line that he's been saying about, sort of calling protesters terrorists and, provocateurs and all the rest of it, I think it's going to become quite hard for Europe to ignore. I don't think America is going to care. I don't think Donald Trump is going to care at any point. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see how far it has to go before the first European country breaks ranks and says something.
Owen?
Yeah, well, but the problem is that they can say all they like. I mean, what can they actually do? Ironically, one thing that actually really is in the gift of Europe is actually, future success of an Erdogan success, of an Erdogan successor regime, because Europe represents investment, Europe represents financial stability, Europe is all about ratings and confidence. So actually, all things that Erdogan has just systematically sort of screwed the pooch over. He's just completely lost the confidence of markets. But the markets and the confidence and the economics are not really in the gift of politicians. So it's hard to know whether even if the Erdogan's repression reached such a level that there was an outcry in the world. Well, it would just be an outcry because actually there's no real levers of influence anymore, and there's not really anything that Turkey kind of needs from anyone apart from things like, there's potentially very radical measure that the EU could suspend Turkey's customs union membership, for instance. That would be like a sort of nuclear option for Brussels, but also quite damaging, but even more damaging for the Turkish economy, and something that's actually would make Turks' lives immediately far worse and collapse the economy, and with unpredictable results, because as Hannah said, there's the CHP in Imamoglu are by no means the only opposition forces. You have the MHP, who's the ultra nationalists. You have you still have fragments of Kurdish resistance which may flare up again. I mean, it's a febrile situation, and collapsing Turkey is not something that Europe could or should do lightly. So the bottom line is, I think condemnation is even if and when it comes, is not actually going to have any practical impact.
Is it time to stop talking about toxic masculinity? Everyone this week has been discussing the Adolescence show on Netflix. I caught up with Toby Young and James Walton earlier this week about why they're fed up with toxic masculinity. The closest thing to TV perfection in decades, and 99% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. So Adolescence got a very high rating with the general public. That first review was from The Guardian. James, from your piece in the magazine last week, it seems like you didn't quite agree with people's view of the Adolescence TV show.
No, it might have been because I sort of came to it slightly looking back. So I came a week later because just once the sort of dust had settled to just see what it was like. And maybe my expectations were too high. I mean, it is a good show. It's well acted. It's got a great script. But I felt, first of all, it was too on the nail, really. And I think one of the reasons it got such good reviews is it's said all the things that we've decided are true. It's the latest. I mean, that is a very fashionable opinion
this
in a way.
Manosphere sort of
the
stuff.
toxic. I mean, I said it was a bit heartless, really, but that toxic masculinity is the new sexual abuse. So basically, in the old days, in recent years, whenever someone was behaving oddly or seemed unhappy or damaged or something, the question was, why are they like this? And then, every single time it was because of sexual abuse in their childhood. And now it's every single time because of toxic masculinity. And it just felt a bit pat, really, almost. And also, I mean, I think most people would know by now, it wasn't just that this 13-year-old boy had, developed some dodgy opinions. He'd actually repeatedly stabbed one of his classmates to death with a knife. Well, obviously, you tend to stab with a knife. Yeah. But that just felt a bit of a leap that was never quite explained either.
Yes, but we do talk a lot about toxic masculinity, even at the Spectator, Toby. Boys' identity crisis, what they're doing online. I mean, it did seem to talk about all the topics that everyone seems to be going on about at the moment.
Yeah, I'm like James. I wasn't all that overbowled by the series. And I think one of the reasons it's met with such a chorus of approval, particularly in the mainstream media, is because it's just repeating back to the liberal metropolitan elite what they already think about the causes of knife crime and the dangers that influencers like Andrew Tate pose to women and girls. And we're in this sort of incredible loop. There might be a less polite term for it, but let's call it a loop in which the metropolitan liberal elite make a television program, a fictional drama, which exemplifies all their groupthink, and then cite it as evidence subsequently that their groupthink is spot on. I mean, at one point, Keir Starmer, and incidentally, the production company that made Adolescence was part state funded. Keir Starmer described it, it was a slip of the tongue, as a documentary in the House of Commons. And I think that is how it's viewed. I mean, that was a Freudian slip, I think. That is how it's viewed by the metropolitan liberal elite. They think this is virtually, if not a documentary, a docudrama, that it's an incredibly accurate portrayal of exactly what's gone wrong in the lives of adolescent white boys, particularly white working class boys, like the character in the film. And actually, it bears very little resemblance to reality. There was a poll recently which showed that I think 13 to 15-year-old boys, something like 83% had heard of Andrew Tate, but only 23% had a favourable opinion of him. More than 60% had an unfavourable opinion. So it's not as if, he enjoys this extraordinary kudos. Most adolescent boys dislike Andrew Tate. And the ones who like him are disproportionately black and Asian, not white. I think another difficulty is that, it's just hooey to think that the main threat of violence posed to women and girls, particularly girls, are white working class boys brought up in stable two-parent families. I mean, that's just total hooey. And you know, the main writer of the series claimed that he'd based it on 3 real-life cases. In every case, the perpetrator was not a white working class teenage boy from a stable family background, and you can see why, you know, the appalling murders by Axel Rudakabana has prompted a kind of moral panic about this. But this is a complete misdiagnosis of what the causes of that episode were and what the kind of solution is. And the idea now that this is going to be shown in schools, and there's been a real clamour for Adolescence to be shown in schools, to teach boys, you know, why they should resist these kind of toxic influences. The idea that these poor mites are going to have to sit through this hooey and kind of and self-flagellate afterwards and explain to their classmates why it is that, you know, masculinity is toxic and should at all costs be, you know, handled with tongs. It's awful to think, you know, they're in a bad enough way as it is without being demonised yet again by the mainstream media and their schools and MPs.
I mean, I think I'm probably happier to be one of the metropolitan liberal elite than you are, Toby. But even from that point of view, I mean, I think you are right. And also I think that might have been part of its appeal, not just as a sort of thesis, but also why people enjoyed it so much. Because in a way, it's a kind of horror film, and what horror films have always done is played on, obviously, people's darkest fears in a slightly entertaining fear. And in this case, I think one of our darkest fears is we don't know what the hell our children are up to on the internet.
Yeah.
And I don't, and it is a bit of a fear. But so I think part of its appeal was that it was titillating. I think that shouldn't be.
Did it not get a conversation?
Titillating for parents.
Did it not get a conversation going? Both of you have sons, and I read in Tim Stanley's piece in the Telegraph. It made him have a long conversation, long debate with his mum about whether he blames the boy, how much responsibility, or if this boy is just incredibly tortured. In the least, it's a conversation started to find out what boys are doing in their bedrooms.
I mean, possibly, but again, I think it's probably over the top to say it started a conversation. In a way, it's crystallised something that we've now all decided. And I do wonder if, so rather than questioning that thing that we've now all decided, it absolutely parroted it. And I just wonder how helpful that is. Also, I do sort of wonder, as having a boy, although he's now 18, and asked him about this, he said he'd never come across anything like this when he was 13 or 14, but then acknowledged that 5 years might be a long time in online life. But to keep telling boys, God, you're under a lot of pressure and everybody thinks you're terrible, puts them under a lot of pressure and makes them think they're terrible, I think.
This should be seen in the context of the Online Safety Act, which has empowered Ofcom to impose these swinging fines on social media companies up to 10% of their annual global turnover, so hundreds of millions of pounds in the case of X and Facebook, if they don't remove unlawful content. And many people, certainly in the Labour Party, but even people on the same side as me, think that it didn't go nearly far enough and that it should have empowered Ofcom to remove lawful but awful, legal but harmful content as well. And this series felt like an argument for beefing up Ofcom's powers under the Online Safety Act to remove more content that's lawful but could have a harmful impact on young men. And it's also been invoked by people who want to ban mobile phones, smartphones in schools, or even wider than that for people aged under 16. And this idea that boys in particular are at great risk of being manipulated, turned into violent misogynists by watching content that's perfectly lawful online or listening to people like Andrew Tate. I mean, there's very little evidence of that. In fact, the evidence of the psychological harm caused to adolescents by smartphone use is that it causes much more harm to teenage girls than it does to teenage boys. And you know, in the case of Axel Rudakabana, we know that, yes, he was in part radicalised by content he found, on the dark web, such as instructions about how to make anthrax, or whatever it was. But that's already unlawful. So we don't need to beef up Ofcom's powers in order to, avoid a repeat of that. So it felt like, a pro-censorship argument made by people in cahoots with interest groups and even the state in favour of even more censorship, which is now being pointed at as evidence that we need more censorship of social media to protect young adolescent boys in particular. So it felt like, just a liberal metropolitan echo chamber in which there really isn't any proper scrutiny of this kind of groupthink about what are the real dangers posed to women and girls.
But in its slight defence, it didn't preach that, though. I mean, the one thing I think was quite good about it is at the very end, it's pretty much helpless. They're pretty helpless. What could we have done? Was there anything we could have done? We don't know. Yeah. Possibly not. This is the parents speaking.
Yes.
Not altogether surprisingly, James, the responsible father was the black police officer who says to his son, "I love you. Let's spend some quality time together," and persuades his son to go to a Chinese restaurant with him where they can have a real heart-to-heart and he can tell him how much he loves him and model positive masculine behaviour, which is something that the father of the 13-year-old murderer doesn't do. He left his son to his own devices, and at the end, when he kind of breaks down and kind of in a kind of bout of self-pitying self-recrimination and cries lying on his son's bed, I think the lesson is that he's been a bad father and he is being punished for not having told his son that he loves him, not behaving more like this male role model who is the black police officer. You didn't get that? Am I reading too much into it?
No. I mean, I think that reading is possible, but I think it was far more sympathetic to the Stephen Graham, who is of course great in it.
The acting.
He plays the dad. I don't think we're meant to think he's a bad father. I mean, he was just working. He was working quite hard to look after the family, and like most of us, I don't know. We don't know what our children are doing on the internet, and I think that's harsh. Also, you do slightly feel for any son whose dad says, let's go along and let's talk about masculinity. You think, oh bloody hell, poor kid.
Please no.
Dad, please not. Let me just go on my phone, will you?
I think sort of one thing I would say in mitigation of the makers of Adolescence is that the behaviour of the girl who triggers the boy into his kind of terrible behaviour isn't great either. So she accuses him of being an incel and leaves these emojis underneath his Instagram posts which indicate he's an incel, and other people pile on. I mean, when I discussed it with my wife and said what I've said about it, she said no. It also showed that girls' behaviour can be toxic too, but that's certainly not how it's being taken up. When people talk about adolescence being shown in schools, they talk about the benefit to young boys, adolescent males, not adolescent girls. I don't think that's going to be singled out, and the girls in the class are going to be told, don't do this because it can be really undermining for boys. That they may have included that, but it's got completely lost in the kind of public reception of the series.
I'd make also two general points that might be dripping with complacency there, but let's see. First of all, that every single time something new comes along that is part of kids' lives that wasn't part of their parents' lives, parents decide that it must be dangerous and terrible, don't they? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when watching television was bad for your eyes or something. It's fairly desperate, but or watching ITV was bad for your soul for some kids in our school. And then, what was the other? Yes, the other general point was that, and I think this happens a lot now, is mistaking sort of outliers for representatives. So, I mean, it just happens all the time. If you hear someone talking in the cinema, you tend to think, oh God, everyone talks in the cinema now. No, actually, it's just that person. So, again, possibly complacency, but the idea that this is an epidemic, and as I say, also that general fear of anything that wasn't around in our childhood being part of our children's childhood, I think they're factors in the response to this show too.
There's a Couple more themes I want to pick up on. Toby, you'll probably know more about this one as a governor of a school. You've done a lot of work in education. What really stood out to me was the behaviour in the schools. Obviously, it's a fictionalised show and they're going to dramatise poor behaviour. But the pervasiveness of the phones in the classrooms constantly, the teachers losing their temper because all the kids have their phones out, all the kids taking videos. Is it really that bad in schools?
Well, I didn't recognise any of the free schools that I've co-founded or currently sit within the Multi-Academy Trust that I set up alongside some academies, where behaviour management is taken very seriously, and there's sort of a zero tolerance for that kind of behaviour policy, which seems to work quite well, as exemplified by Catherine Burblesing's behaviour policy at Michaela. That's the sort of gold standard, I think. But I'm sure that in some schools, behaviour is like that. And actually, one of my reservations about the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill is that it does put various obstacles in place which are going to make it more difficult for schools to put rigorous, robust behaviour management systems in place, such as making it harder to exclude children who assault teachers, for instance. But at our school, we do have, at all of our schools, I think we have a policy of banning the bringing of phones into classrooms. And if they do get their phones out in the classroom, they're taken away from them for the rest of the week. And that does work, I think, reasonably well. And I'm certainly not opposed to that policy in schools. And the school in the programme was a kind of, I think, every parent's worst nightmare. What a kind of Think Comprehensive looks like.
Yeah, my daughter's still at the South London compound. I was asking her, she says, it's not quite like that. But I think one thing I was saying to her, I think you're right. I think that the phones, children and phones, is definitely on the way out. I think I was saying to her that I think she'll be telling her kids, we used to be on phones all the time, the way that I now say to my kids, we used to smoke on planes.
Yes, totally.
In trains, we just light up. It was great. And they just cannot believe that ever happened.
Yeah.
And I think kids and phones,
there will have been an adjustment.
It might be like that,
yeah. I thought for me one theme that wasn't picked up on enough or wasn't brought up enough in the series, given that how much of a problem it is in the UK, is the idea of fatherlessness. Obviously, the police officer, there was a bit of a theme where this boy basically grew up without his dad around. And given the stats that we're looking at now about how bad the issue of fatherlessness is, that there was no connection between boys' poor behaviour in the series and the concept that, apparently there's a statistic Miriam Cates uncovered that you're more likely to own a smartphone than you are to have a dad in your house at the moment, and the consequences are terrible. And it just wasn't brought up in the series.
No, I think that's one thing where Toby and I definitely disagree. I don't think this guy was meant to be a bad father. I think he was meant to be a good father, and I think it was meant to be. Even if you're a good father, if you take your eye off the ball, this will happen.
But no, I think that's right, Natasha. I think if we have a problem in this country with the behaviour of adolescent boys, then the absence of positive male role models in their life is the cause. It's not toxic influencers like Andrew Tate, who of course fill that vacuum. And you're right. I think something like 85% of boys brought up in single-parent households, the heads of those households are women, not men. Something like 75% of teachers overall, if you combine primary and secondary, are women. So boys don't get to see male teachers modelling kind of what is good, appropriate male behaviour either. And I think that's at the root of the problem, if there is a problem, not too much spending too long playing video games in your room at night.
Last question, because we've been playing this game for the last 2 weeks in the office.
Oh, God. Uh-oh.
When Miriam Cates came on, she suggested a good male role model for boys could be the likes of Jordan Peterson. It was a hot debate. Not everyone agrees. Could both of you give a male role model for your sons who you think that they could look up to, and ideally someone that the viewers would know, and not yourselves?
Okay, that's
ruling yourself out.
Wasn't going to do that anyway. Just note in passing that Andrew Tate is now like a real he's like the old boogeyman, isn't he? He's like
I think so, yeah.
Almost mythological satanic figure for for us. Paul McCartney, too old?
Sure.
I'm playing for time. Toby, have you got anyone?
It's quite difficult, isn't it? I mean, I can think of. I mean, it's quite. You have to go quite far back in kind of popular culture.
That's interesting.
I mean, even if you go back to the original Snow White, she had a kind of negligent father who allowed the stepmother to kind of torture her.
Ben Stokes, cricketer.
Sure.
Will you give me him?
We'll give him that.
I mean, I know he punches a few people when he's drunk.
Yeah.
But that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
It's interesting how difficult
I'm
this
doing
is.
No, it isn't. No, honestly, a
I can't really think of
bit of
any-
notice, like 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
We could have come up with some rackers for this. I'm determined to get someone, though.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about men who model kind of what we think of as kind of positive masculine character traits, like being good-humoured, being quite tolerant, being quite independent-minded, strong but not kind of overbearing. I mean, is Jeremy Clarkson too much of a stretch?
Ooh.
Okay, I'd see your Jeremy Clarkson, and I raise you, Danny Dyer. Now, Danny Dyer did an incredibly interesting pair of programmes on exactly this, modern masculinity, a few months ago. They were presumably still available on, I think, probably Channel 4, can't remember. And he was really good on all this stuff. I mean, obviously he does his geezer act, but he's quite, as geezers go, extremely thoughtful one. And I like it. I can't believe I'm recommending Danny Dyer. But actually, it was a very good show, and he was quite strong on that idea of men, in a way, wanting to look after their families, and that should not be despised.
I always, whenever I rewatch Darkest Hour late at night, having had a few wines, I'm always brought to tears by the kind of heroic portrayal of Churchill. When we think of positive role models,
You're going to go Winston Churchill.
Well, but I think the problem with some of these kind of great male leaders of the past is that, of course, they weren't always perfect family men. They didn't always spend a great deal of time, with their children, and that seems to be, because that's now a requirement of being a positive male role model. It's hard to kind of look back historically and find male examples of that. But I think a lot of current young men could do worse than turn away from Andrew Tate towards Winston Churchill.
Excellent. Well, Toby and James, thank you so much for joining us.
It's such a pleasure.
One of the top stories this week has been the Signal War Leak group chat in America. Our editor of Spec US, Freddy Gray, spoke to editor-at-large Ben Domenech.
For viewers that don't know, this is about Jeffrey Goldberg, who is editor of The Atlantic, and he wrote a mind-blowing, jaw-dropping, extraordinary story that was published yesterday about how he was added to a signal group on which there were J.D. Vance, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, essentially all the most important people in the Trump administration, apart from Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, I should add, Director of Intelligence, to a group. This group was discussing the bombing of the Houthis. Jeffrey Goldberg thought it was probably a prank. Jeffrey Goldberg, I should say, who is a long-term critic, almost an obsessive critic at times of the Trump administration. And yet it seems the story is real. There's quite a lot to unpack from it, so I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Domenech, who is the Spectator's editor-at-large. And we should start, Ben, by saying, how do you think this actually happened? Do you believe that it was just an accidental ad that Mike Waltz, who I didn't mention, who I should have mentioned in that introduction, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, added Jeffrey Goldberg? Was it just by accident? It seems to have been.
It certainly seems to have been. And Freddie, I think that we're still in the early days of this, and what we're going to see in the coming days is that Congress is going to have a lot of questions following up on how this happened, or we're probably going to learn more. But the early going certainly does seem to indicate that this was just a massive screw up on the part of Mike Waltz. And I want to take a step back because for our listeners who are not familiar with the background of some of the people that we're talking about, or who are only, early on coming to know who they are, one thing to keep in mind is that Mike Waltz is, at least in the context of Washington, D.C., viewed as perhaps the least controversial and most trusted in terms of Capitol Hill guy who is the part of this team, perhaps other than Senator Marco Rubio, meaning that when it came to the foreign policy team that President Trump built, there were questions about Pete Hegseth, there were questions about Tulsi Gabbard, there were questions about others who were going to be part of the team at different levels and have different responsibilities. But very few people had any issues with Mike Waltz, and they viewed him as someone who's very trustworthy, just given his background. He's 50 years old. He's a veteran of the war on terror. He's, a lauded sort of guy, a foreign policy expert on Capitol Hill. And because of that, the fact that it seems to have been his screw up here surprises a lot of people. However, I will give you a little bit of background information myself, which is that Mike Waltz is someone who does talk quite freely to a lot of journalists. I'm not alone in having this opinion of him. In fact, the last time I saw him, I asked for his new number when he was going into the admin, because I figured that at some point we would talk. We haven't texted since then, so I don't think I'm going to be. I would not expect his number to be the same going forward. But the point is just this: he is someone who's viewed with a lot of respect, and so for him to screw up in this way, as it seems to be on the surface, is something that I think comes as a surprise to a lot of people. There's already been a quote from the new senator from Montana, Tim Sheehy, to the extent of saying, well, someone effed up. And that's clearly going to be a line of pursuit in terms of conversations with Tulsi Gabbard on Capitol Hill, as well as John Ratcliffe, the new head of the CIA. And that's something that I think is really the first incident that we've had in this administration of the White House itself screwing up, meaning we've had some screw ups that have happened on other levels, either by DOJ or by, I think in particular, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has been viewed as having made some mistakes in terms of her early going here. But the White House itself really did not have the equivalent of something like what happened with the so-called Muslim ban that was Steve Bannon's baby back in the first administration, where they had a screw up right off the bat, stumbled over themselves, etc. This is really the first one of significance. And while it does seem that there were not, perhaps, full-on war plans or something like that leaked, the information that came out did come out before these strikes happened. Jeffrey Goldberg, to I think his credit, actually sat on it. But then also the fact that he was added in the first place has to be questioned, and also why they were using something, even something that is, respected as an encrypted conversational aspect signal, to go back and forth on this. I think that the Congress is going to have a ton of questions about what happened, and we're going to see them pursue that in the coming days.
And indeed, you mentioned Mike Waltz being somebody who talks to journalists, but the fact that he clearly has talked to Jeffrey Goldberg in the past might raise some suspicions within Trump world, because, of course, Jeffrey Goldberg is the author of the, some think, highly dubious story about Donald Trump refusing to visit a cemetery. I think it was back in 2019. The very fact that he is seems to be on texting terms with Jeffrey Goldberg is itself a sign for some people in Trump world that he is a figure who should be treated with suspicion.
I certainly think you're correct about that, Freddie. And one of the things to keep in mind about that story, of course, is that, and I still do view that story as very dubious. One of the reasons that I do, along with many others in Washington, even those who are Trump critics, is that John Bolton, who was supposed to have been a witness or present during that entire process, and who himself is, of course, an enormous critic of the president, himself came out and said that that this was not true, that this was not something that happened. Goldberg, of course, has stuck to his guns, claimed that the suckers and losers comment is something that happened. But I think that there are a lot of us within the DC journalism cohort who view it with a good degree of suspicion simply because there were so many people who don't like the president anyway who came out and said it didn't happen. But Goldberg, and this is something to keep in mind, this is not just someone who is a critic of the president. This is one of the most prominent critics of the president. This is someone who, put a cover story together in the Atlantic magazine, essentially warning the country against the horrible nature of reelecting Donald Trump, repeatedly, employing people who've gone after him in so many different respects. And so the idea that Mike Waltz would just accidentally add him to a list came as somewhat of a surprise. Now, there have been theories advanced, including by Emily Jashinsky over at Unheard, who has noted that there are a couple possibilities here, but one includes the possibility that there is another figure within the government who might have shared the same initials with Jeffrey Goldberg, and that perhaps that was who Mike Waltz was seeking to add. But one thing that I do find amusing about this is that behind the scenes, the people in question do seem to be very legitimate in the sense that Waltz is the most hawkish of those having this conversation. You have kind of Pete Hegseth a little bit in the middle, and you have J.D. Vance being the most concerned about the ramifications of these strikes, and if they would lead to the United States being sucked into a larger conflict. And so, to be honest, on a certain level, there's an amusement factor here in addition to the serious security concerns. That is one of the reasons that all of Washington is talking about this and has been sharing memes and jokes and that kind of thing behind the scenes, because it is just one of the bizarre moments that we've seen play out in the Trump era. It's just to such a heightened degree because it includes so many different participants from the foreign policy and national security sphere.
It is amazingly hilarious in several ways. I mean, I heard somebody say, I think I read it on X, that this is a bit like Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor to Joe Biden, looping in Tucker Carlson into a text chain. It's the worst possible person they could have looped in.
Yes, the point is that you didn't add someone to it who was, a parent at your kid's school, or someone, like there's so many other people you could have added where it would have been embarrassing, but it would not have been someone who is such a prominent critic. And the fact that it is just is something that gives fuel to this and creates, I think, a whole conversation around this that at the staff level, at least, is an item of amusement. But I will say this. The president and his team, really ran against Joe Biden and against Hillary Clinton before that, based on arguments around security that they certainly used against them quite frequently. Obviously, the most recent example of this is that in the wake of that Mar-a-Lago raid, where we found that the former president had taken so many different boxes of material, including questionable material, whether it was classified or the like, that he had taken out of the White House and had in potentially non-secure ways within his Mar-a-Lago home. That was obviously an aspect that then led to us discovering that Joe Biden had an equivalent problem, that he had been storing things within his own garage that were unacceptable. He did assure us that he locked the garage quite a lot. So, but the thing that is interesting is to go from Hillary Clinton having her email server to the argument about those documents to something like this. It overall indicates, I think, to the American people that we have a real problem when it comes to security, operational security at the highest levels within government that hasn't gone away even with this new administration. And while there were certainly concerns about that in the last administration, I mean, you had Lloyd Austin, for instance, the defense secretary, the Secretary of Defense, and you had other people associated with him who hid the fact that he basically was disappeared because of medical issues for quite some time. This is something that I think is a continual problem. And in this era, when so many people are so loosey-goosey when it comes to the way that they talk about things, so willing to use some of these quote-unquote secure apps of sometimes dubious security to communicate with each other, that it creates opportunities for America's enemies to use this information against them in very negative and dangerous ways. That didn't obviously happen in the case of these strikes, but it certainly could have.
Well, you referred to it there a bit earlier, but let's talk about the substance of the conversations on those messages that we have seen, because we haven't seen all of it. Jeffrey Goldberg reserved some of it. But it seems to me that Speaker Mike Johnson has tried to defend the story. While obviously all Republicans, I think, are a little embarrassed by this story. Mike Johnson said, actually, you can see a cohesive team working together, and I've heard other people say similar things. There does seem to be a sort of an agreement of purpose, but there is this interesting digression where J.D. Vance, the vice president, says he's not sure the president is entirely aware, I think is the word he used, maybe I got it wrong, of how this looks. Because of the Europe that the message we're trying to put across, the America First message we're trying to put across about Europe, because Europe gets 40% of its trade through the Suez Canal, which is where they were bombing the Houthis, and America only gets 3%. So essentially, America is, to use Vance's word, bailing out Europe again. Yes. And Pete Hegseth says, yes, it's pathetic in capital letters. That clearly shows you the way they're thinking about foreign policy. What did you read into that?
No, I think you're completely right to highlight that portion, because it's one of the areas where I think we can gather a bit more about their thinking than we had before we had this information. And though it is consistent with what I think a lot of us have believed, which is that they simply do not view the Europeans as being equal partners in this effort, and they view them as being a long way away from being capable of being the kind of partners that they would like them to be. Meaning that, this is something where they feel like this is not a problem that America necessarily should have to solve for the sake of their European allies. And I think that, Hegseth sort of indicates that he's aligned himself a little bit more with the J.D. Vance critique of Europe within that context, as opposed to perhaps the more traditional Republican view of America's role in the world. Now, whether that's something that extends out to other areas of policy as well, areas that are, at least from my perspective, far more important than the Houthis, that's something that I think is still an open question. But it does, I think, provide some insight into, the different alignments that people are pursuing within this administration. This is a group of people who I truly believe represent the spectrum on the right of the differences on foreign policy and national security in a way that is indicative of where people actually are. Meaning that you have a Republican coalition where there are people who are still kind of in each of these different lanes. And while perhaps the most neoconservative members of the Republican cohort have been banished or self-deported themselves into the Democratic coalition, they still have, some remnants of people who have different opinions about foreign policy going forward that could play a role within this agenda. And one thing that could come, quite frankly, from this moment is, and this is something that members of Congress are mindful of, and certainly those in Washington who pay attention to it are mindful of, is that if Mike Waltz ends up being the person who suffers because of this, in terms of whether it's, I don't actually think he's going to be pushed out. That's my own feeling at the moment after talking to several people. But I do think that this does hurt him within this White House. And it could mean to his voice being listened to less within the room. And that's something that has potential impacts on foreign policy and national security. We've seen lesser offenses sideline people within Trump world. And this one is certainly the first, as I said, major screw up to come in this White House. And it comes from someone who not a lot of people thought of as being a screw up beforehand.
Mm. And wounded Europeans may be feeling a bit miffed about it. There's another country, of course, that is involved in this story, which is Israel. And Hegseth even at one point mentions Israel and says, if we don't do it, Israel are going to do, as in if we don't strike the Houthis, Israel are going to do it first. And so the conclusion of that is that American First agenda is very willing to help Israel if it serves America's interests. And Europe is out of favor, but Middle Eastern allies are more important to the foreign policy agenda than European allies, arguably.
I think that's 100% true, and I don't think there's any indication otherwise. The truth is that they simply don't. They view the Israelis as being, capable of doing a lot of things for themselves in a way that they do not view Europe as currently being capable of doing it, or eager to do it, or, in some cases even willing to do it. And that's, a real difference in terms of the alliance. Look, this moves in both directions. The way that this is depicted often in the conversation within the press and among people of the cast of characters alongside Jeffrey Goldberg, who, by the way, just a few weeks ago was participating in another breaking of norms within Washington, D.C., which was the weaponization of the Gridiron Club dinner, which used to be one of the rare moments of bipartisanship in the city, in a comedy routine that was just outright attacking the president and Elon Musk and others in a way that was viewed as being quite gauche among the DC set, basically invading something that was one of the last vestiges of bipartisan norms and treating it as partisan. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that I expect that this upcoming next month White House Correspondents' Dinner to be one that is perhaps one of the least attended by anybody who is not on the left in Washington, simply because there is no longer, after all of the different steps that the White House has taken against the Associated Press and other members of the Washington press bureaus, there is no longer really any kind of sentiment where this is a place where Republicans and Democrats can come to meet together. But it's very interesting to me that the way that this is going to be depicted is Washington's current foreign policy and national security leadership moving away from Europe, when I think in reality this is something of a mutual activity, that this is them kind of identifying something that they think was already going on. And that they believe that the Europeans have not lived up to their promises, that they have not delivered on the kind of investments needed in order to make sure that there is the type of military presence here that is needed. Now, I have my own opinions about that, but that's certainly the opinions of this administration. And I think that this text chain is just one more indication of it.
Lastly, Ben, there's J.D. Vance. The insight into J.D. Vance is quite interesting because at one level you see that the rest of the group seem to be eager to agree with him. Hegseth says agree, VP agree in response to him a couple of times, I think, as do others. They say we share your concern. But the second point is that he had this concern that the president was not really in the loop as to what was going on. Donald Trump, I think it's fair to say, won't like that being public. And J.D. Vance's spokesman yesterday was very keen to say the president and the vice president have spoken about this, they're aligned on foreign policy and so on. But that is the story is pretty bad for J.D. Vance in some ways, isn't it?
Well, I think yes, but less so. But I think that it's one of these things where it's more about one of the things that is really interesting about this, and I don't mean to go long with a final question, but one of the things that's really interesting about all of these disputes is that everyone represents themselves as representing the interests of the president, meaning I am representing the president when I'm making this argument for this thing that I think, okay? And that is often of dubious nature in terms of what the president has actually said. I personally believe that this is intentional on the president's part, because I think he likes to see people go back and forth, take different sides of a different issue. He's more subtle than people, I think, give him credit for when it comes to a lot of the indications that he gives. And a lot of the time you have to prove yourself in terms of making a bet that the president is going to side with you in a key moment. And if he doesn't, then you'll be out of a job. And one of the things that is indicated by this conversation that I think we have back and forth is that J.D. Vance is internally making the argument that he represents what the president wants. He is pursuing the president's foreign policy. And the subtle implication there, of course, is that there are others within the admin who may or may not be as closely aligned. Now, I think there are a lot of critics of J.D. Vance who would say, actually, he is not in exactly the same lane as the president. The president is himself more hawkish, certainly more willing to use military power in the past, and perhaps more willing to use it than J.D. Vance is currently in the moment. And so that's something that we're still figuring out. The foreign policy, like I said, has a spectrum of different people with different beliefs, including beliefs about central aspects of intelligence policy and the like, not just power projection. And what I think a lot of us are waiting for is, how aggressive does the president want to be in certain aspects of this? One example that I'll give you that is not, of course, talked about in this conversation is the relationship that the United States currently has with Mexico. There was a lot of back and forth internally about, does the president really want to name these various cartels as being foreign terror organizations, something that Mike Waltz has spearheaded and that I think Marco Rubio is certainly in favor of. But at the same time, there's differences of opinion about whether, what the ramifications of doing that would be. And certainly there are people who had concerns that this would lead to a real conflict with Mexico that could spill over into so many different ways. So we're still in the early going of this administration, and we're still figuring out what areas are, of the biggest priority within these foreign policy decisions and national security decisions are ones where each of these different figures is most closely aligned with the president, and ones where they might be not quite aligned in terms of their priorities or in terms of how much force they are willing to deploy.
Yes, we need to get somebody needs to be added to the PC signals group on Mexico.
Yes, and if someone wants to do that with me, I'm happy to lurk in the background for a while.
We also had the spring statement this week, and our new economics editor, Michael Simmons, takes you through everything you need to know in under 5 minutes.
Rachel Reeves found herself in this position today because reports suggested rising borrowing costs at the start of the year had wiped out the £9.9 billion of headroom against her ironclad fiscal rules that she left herself with after the last budget in the autumn. Figures in the Office for Budget Responsibility's Economic and Fiscal Outlook report, which we have here, show that headroom was indeed completely wiped away. And in fact, had the Chancellor not acted today, she would have broken her fiscal rule by over £4 billion. Cuts she has made to welfare and other budgets return her exactly to that £10 billion of headroom again, though the OBR have given her just a 50-50 chance of not blowing it. The headline takeaways from the OBR's forecast is a halving of growth projections, down to 1% this year, followed by 1.9% in 2026, 1.8% the year after, 1.7% the year after that, and then 1.8% by the end of the forecast period. These predictions are bleak and are stagnation, and they leave the government with little room to manoeuvre. There is a worsening picture of inflation too, with the forecast expecting prices to rise at an average of over 3% this year, up from the 2.6% that had been forecast in October. Inflation won't fall back to the Bank of England's 2% target until 2027. Compared with October too, and despite her pledge to grow her way out of Britain's economic and fiscal crisis, Reeves has increased her borrowing plans. This year, her plans have the government borrowing £10 billion more than had been planned for in October, and nearly £50 billion more over the entire forecast period. On welfare, Reeves confirms that the OBR did not agree that the government's spending cuts announced last week tot up to £5 billion. And after more emergency cuts to disability benefits, the OBR have scored the welfare reforms at just £3.4 billion. That's a tiny cutback in a bill that's already set to soar to just under £100 billion for sickness and disability alone in the next 4 years. The Chancellor is also stubbornly sticking to her £25 billion raid on employers' national insurance, which the OBR previously said would have a real effect on damaging workforce participation rates. Nothing changes in this set of forecasts. The OBR has employment falling across the 5-year period, though the overall rate will be higher than they had forecast at the last budget. What's more, the OBR has neglected to score the negative effects of Labour's Make Work Pay plans because, As they say, there is not yet sufficient detail or clarity about the final policy parameters, though they do say that any effect is likely to be net negative. When economists do assess these policies, it could cast serious doubt on the growth forecasts we've seen today. Bad news on tax too. Despite no policy changes today, as Reeves had promised, we're now just a year away from the tax burden reaching its highest level in history. In 2 years' time, it will hit 37.4% of GDP and will beat the post-war record set in 1948. One piece of luck Rachel Reeves had ahead of her statement was the timing of when the OBR makes their forecasts and something called the conditioning window, through which it looks at market expectations for borrowing costs. The window was the 10 working days to the 12th of February, and in that time, expectations fell after the Bank of England cut its interest rate to 4.5%. Since then, they have risen. This will have saved Reeves billions from the forecast for debt interest. Good for her today, but if borrowing costs stay elevated, it means her headroom for autumn is already disappearing. What's most remarkable about this Sprigg statement to me is the increasingly influential role of the OBR. Reeves's tweaks have taken her £9.9 billion headroom back to £9.9 billion almost within the penny. Continuing to make policy in this way is what leads to obscure tinkering to PIP assessment rules and a spending envelope that appears nothing more than fantasy. Whilst we're far better off relying on an independent forecaster, it's no recipe for serious reform. The risk now, as the IFS's Paul Johnson points out, is that we spend the summer speculating about the tax rises that must surely be coming if borrowing costs rise again or forecasts change, and the Chancellor's margin for error is once again wiped out.
Next, Svitlana Morenets and the Deputy Foreign Minister Mariana Betsa have a discussion about the missing children in Ukraine from the war.
Moscow say they have transferred over 700,000 Ukrainian children to Russia. What is the real number?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor, and I'm here in London with the purpose of lobbying the issue of the return of Ukrainian children. It is very high on our agenda, and this is one of the most critical issues that should be involved in all peace talks or any negotiations. The figures, though, are much higher. In general, 1.6 million Ukrainian kids are in temporarily occupied territories, including in Crimea, and around 20,000 Ukrainian children have been deported by Russia in grave breach of international law. But of course, this figure rises every day because as we speak with you, there are ongoing deportations. And for Ukraine, it's critical that every child is brought home and every child is reunited with their family.
Does Ukraine know the exact locations of these children, especially those who were deported to Russia?
You know, it's a very complex issue. The President of Ukraine launched an initiative, Bring Kids Back UA, which involves governmental and non-governmental sectors, and definitely is aimed at locating, identifying, and also trying to reintegrate those children back in Ukraine. It's very difficult to trace these children for many reasons. First and foremost, Russia abducts children, grave breach of international law, Geneva Conventions, and deports them to Russia. Russia gives them Russian citizenship. Russia changes or alters their names, gives them their different passports, and very often, very small, especially kids, they're being adopted by Russian families. Of course, it's so-called adopted because it is in breach with international norms. Therefore, it's very difficult to verify these children. But we're doing our best. We're working with many international partners, but also in terms of our law enforcement authorities, trying to identify them, locate them, rescue them, and bring them home.
Last month, Trump's administration has cut the funding for the researchers who were busy locating those children. And some researchers said that all of the data that they gathered have been deleted. What do you know about it?
I do hope that the data will be forwarded to Ukraine. It is crucial for accountability. As Ukraine stated on numerous occasions, Ukraine wants peace, but not just any peace. We need just peace, and we need full responsibility and accountability of Russia for the crimes of aggression, genocide and war crimes. So this data, which had the Yale laboratory, is still there, and we do hope that it will be transferred to Ukraine for further investigations and bringing those war criminals to justice.
But are there negotiations about it with Trump's administration, or you just hope that they will do it?
Well, we have placed this issue that we need this data, and I hope that they will be transferred to us.
Volodymyr Zelensky says that returning Ukrainian children from Russia is his red line for the peace talks, and if Russia wants the war to end, then all of the children must return. After the talks in Saudi Arabia, do we know what is Russia's position on this issue?
Well, it's important what is our position on this issue. Ukraine needs all children back home, and this is a clear position of President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, of the government of Ukraine, of everyone involved in this process. This is a humanitarian issue. Our children should not be a political bargain in any negotiations. The issue of return should be involved in any peace talks, diplomatic talks, negotiations, meetings. And we raised this issue during the first meeting in Jeddah at the beginning of March, and during the second technical meeting, which took place a few days ago. This is critical, and we urge all countries, and especially, of course, the UK, for your support in exerting pressure on Russia to return these kids.
The US said that in the statement published after the meeting with Ukraine that they support returning Ukrainian children, but did they actually share with Ukraine what they talked about with Russia on this topic? Whether Russia agrees or not?
We are in contact with our US partners, and this issue was highlighted as of utmost urgency for Ukraine, and the US partners agreed that this is extremely important that they are returned.
Also, another red line for Ukraine is all-for-all prisoner exchange. Do we have any progress in that topic?
As you see, we had recently a prisoners release or swap, and 175 Ukrainian prisoners of war were returned. There are two tracks. One track is prisoners of war and illegally detained persons, civilians, and second track, children. And we are working on all these tracks because we need to return prisoners of war, we need to return illegally detained civilians, but we need also to return children. The issue of children is extremely important because many of them are literally from orphanages, many of them are of very small age, and towards many of them, Russia tries to erase identity. They're not adults who can protest, who can definitely keep the memories what Ukraine was. They are trying to erase their identity. And Russification, no Ukrainian language, giving Russian names, learning Russian language, learning Russian history, even singing Russian anthems. These kids are so brainwashed by Russia that it is very difficult for them not only to return, but also to reintegrate into the society, because they are children of different age. And we should understand that this is the most vulnerable group. This is the most vulnerable group because many of them are very small, and they may not remember who their parents are or what Ukraine is. But it is important that we return them because many parents, it's a human disaster when your kid is taken away by force by another country or any terrorist and brought to another country.
What do you think was Putin's strategy behind it? Why did he deport Ukrainian children? Is it because of the demographic crisis in Russia, for example?
No, I don't think so, that it is has any relevance to the demographic crisis. I would say that this is another attempt by Russia to use our kids as an instrument of aggressive policy towards Ukrainian. And it has been done in the past. Actual aggression started in 2014, and the deportation started slowly with the occupied Crimea and with occupied Donbass, some part of Donbass. But of course, the scale of it was much higher from 2022 when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The goal of Russia hasn't changed: to destroy Ukraine as a country and to destroy Ukraine as a nation. And that's why children are important, because children is an important element of the nation. And that's why Russia tries to impose Russian citizenship, to raise Ukrainian identity. This is also, as I said, a very cynical step from Russia, but this is an instrument of war that they use against Ukraine.
2 years ago, I actually interviewed one boy who was taken from the Kherson region from his parents, and he was moved to the re-educational camp in Crimea. And he told me that one of the girls in the camp was sexually assaulted by one of the Russian tutors. Does Ukraine have any evidence to such cases?
Absolutely. We do have cases when children confessed that they were either raped or other forms of sexual violence was used. It's terrible. It's a heinous crime. It's a war crime. It's genocide against Ukrainian children. And we do collect this information. Our competent authorities and prosecutors' office are working on those cases that we know.
The International Criminal Court issued the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for the abduction of Ukrainian children. Do you think Russia could demand that this arrest warrant is withdrawn during the final peace agreement, and is it possible at all?
Well, I would say the arrest warrant is there. It's part of the international legal mechanism. We should not think what Russia will or will not demand. We should force Russia to peace, and we should exert more pressure on Russia to achieve this peace for Ukraine, to get out from Ukraine, but also to return all the children. I would not like to speculate whether it is possible or not to renounce any warrant. It is there, it is valid, it is in force, and it must be implemented by all ICC participating states.
I want to ask a question about the partial ceasefire agreement, and when does it actually start? Because Moscow says it started 1 week ago. Volodymyr Zelensky says it started yesterday. So, what's happening?
The main thing is not to fall into Russian propaganda. They may say whatever they want. They manipulate with information. We know what Russian propaganda, hybrid warfare means. Russia lies on an industrial scale. The first truce in the sky and truce in the sea was proposed by Ukraine at the first meeting in Jeddah to the US administration, to the US colleagues. And then we agreed for the ceasefire for 30 days, if Russia agrees to it. But Russia started putting conditions, while Ukraine unconditionally agreed to ceasefire 3 weeks ago, and Russia started putting conditions. What was achieved the other days, it was the ceasefire in terms of freedom of navigation, ceasefire at the sea, and of course this is the ceasefire in terms of energy objects. Ukraine again showed its full commitment to implement its commitments to peace, again showed its willingness to be committed to peace, but we haven't seen any steps from Russia. Russia keeps on bombing Ukraine and killing civilians every single day. And this next few days will be critical, so they will define what are true actions by Russia.
Why wasn't the civilian infrastructure included in that partial ceasefire deal on the energy infrastructure?
Well, I would say that, any negotiations or any talks or meetings, they're quite complicated in many ways. And we agreed for what was possible to agree, where we found consensus. And we definitely think that this is a good starting point to move forward with our US colleagues and all European allies. And definitely we need more weapons. I mean, it's with regard to our peace, we need more weapons to Ukraine. We need more sanctions on Russia. We need Russia's accountability for its actions before International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, and the future Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression. So it's in overall efforts to achieve peace. There are a number of issues which Ukraine remains committed to, and these are our red lines. And they're very well known. Ukraine needs more weapons, air defense to protect our civilians, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, no territorial compromises, all prisoners of war, illegally detained persons and children should be returned to Ukraine. There should be just peace, and there should be accountability of Russia for this heinous crime. And of course, there should be security guarantees for Ukraine that this crime will not be repeated.
Dmytro Litvin, Zelensky communication advisor, said that Russia already hit energy facilities 8 times since the ceasefire was agreed. What is Ukraine going to do with this information? Are they gathering evidence?
Well, if Russia attacks us, we will respond. It's very clear. It's our right. We are defending ourselves. We are exercising our right to self-defense in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter.
But is it being communicated with the US, like, look, this ceasefire is not working, Russia is...
Of course. I mean, I think the whole world sees that Russia bombs Ukraine every day. Civilian infrastructure, civilians, peaceful children. 3 days ago, a child was killed in Kiev itself. And this family, the father and the child who were killed in their beds, sleeping peaceful, they were running from the war from Zaporizhia region, finding refuge in Kiev, and they were killed by Russia. So, of course, this information is well known to all our partners, all our colleagues, and this is the true face and the true answer of Russia to peace. They don't want peace. They want war, and they need words. It's obvious, and their goal hasn't changed to destroy Ukraine.
What can you say about the progress in bringing together the coalition of the willing, and how can you comment Keir Starmer's efforts to do it?
Oh, we commend the UK and French leadership. It's truly remarkable in terms of the coalition of the willing, in terms of of course, UK support, military, political, humanitarian, financial, security assistance. UK has been a staunchest support and ally of Ukraine. We are very grateful to the Prime Minister of UK and also to all British people. We need to have consolidated and united front against Russia. And we need to stay united in the face of this aggression, especially now in this very critical junction.
But is there any progress about sending the peacekeeping troops to Ukraine?
It's not the right word to say peacekeeping. We say boots on the ground. And this modality is a bit discussed, and the summit will take place in Paris tomorrow. So it is on the agenda. Again, we need the boots on the ground in Ukraine. It is our security guarantee. The best security guarantee is NATO membership, and it is still on the agenda. But before we become a member of the UN, of the NATO, we need boots on the ground. We need military contingent. We need the protection, including, of course, necessary air defense. We need the guarantee that Russia will not repeat aggression again.
Why don't you like to use the phrase in peacekeeping forces?
I don't think it's a correct terminology. We have the UN missions in support of peace. I think the peacekeepers is not a real correct legal terminology in this regard.
And finally, Michael Simmons, our economics editor, and Robert Bryce discuss the fallout from the Heathrow fire and whether this really was linked to the net zero strategy.
Now, the management of Heathrow and the National Grid are still having a bit of a fight over who's responsible for last week's outage that grounded flights for a day and is probably going to have damaged our economy. To discuss this and what it says about Britain's energy resilience, I'm joined by the author and journalist Robert Bryce. Robert, thanks for joining Spectator TV. What do you believe was behind the power outage that brought Heathrow to a standstill and grounded so many flights? Do you think it was a problem of infrastructure, a problem of management, or both?
Yeah, I think it's, both. I think there's no definitive cause that reading up on what the latest investigation is that hasn't been determined. Now, there's also a possibility that this was sabotage, although I think that's probably unlikely. If it was, someone would have likely stepped forward. But I think that, what does this show? It's clear that whether it's in the UK or here in the US, we take this infrastructure for granted. And it shows how easily this critical infrastructure can break and what can the knock-on effects that happen when it breaks. So Catherine Porter wrote a very good analysis of this on her blog, What Logic. But she pointed out that there weren't redundant systems and redundant pathways for transmission lines into Heathrow. So that's a blunder of the first order, given that the airport is critical infrastructure, but also that the transformers themselves, there weren't ready backups, there weren't ready ways to shift the power to other substations. So a number of factors, obviously, disasters like this or serious incidents like this never have one cause. It's always several.
And how do you think, when you're planning an upgrade to an airport, or when you're planning a new infrastructure project, whether it's in the US or over here in the UK, are these things just not thought of, or is it just that an outage like this would be considered so rare that the businesses and the governments behind these projects think we're not going to put redundancies in place because it would be so expensive? Why was this not foreseen?
Well, in everything, everything's 2020 vision in hindsight, right? Well, why didn't we fix this? Weren't we paying attention to this? But let me put that to the side for just a minute, Michael, and just put forward something here that I think has not been given the proper focus. Heathrow Airport has a net zero plan. I mean, come on. What? Your airport has a net zero plan. And so in 2012, what did they do? They put in, this has been reported, a biomass plant that was producing some combined heat and power and had some electrical output, 2 megawatts or something like this. But it wouldn't run unless it was attached to the electric grid. So I just did some calculations. I went on ChatGPT and said, well, how many gallons of jet fuel are consumed at Heathrow? Well, it's about 6 million tons, 6.2 million tons. It's 183 million gallons of jet fuel every year are consumed roughly by the jets that fly in and out of Heathrow. And yet your government has created a net zero plan. I mean, it's just, to use your Britishism, gobsmacking. I mean, loony round the bend. I mean, who's behind this? I mean, we're going to run them on hydrogen. That was one of the other things in the net zero plan. I just thought, the silliness of the whole thing, and it's inattention to the importance of what that transportation infrastructure. It's inattention to this, and then a lot of, I would say, woke climate policy that displays a lack of attention to the critical infrastructure that the airport needs.
Do you think the public views on that specific point about the sort of, not hypocrisy, but the silliness of some net zero projects, do you think the Overton window is shifting on that? Like, as you say, it's plainly ridiculous that what is not just an airport, but is also Britain's largest cargo port, could have net zero goals at all, when, like, literally, as you say, it is a very carbon heavy thing. It always is going to be, unless someone suddenly invents, solar powered planes. Do you think the public are waking up to how silly these things are, and that they don't marry up well?
Well, I think the public is, but unfortunately, I think the Tories and Labour haven't. Now, we do see a different tone coming from the Tories now with Kimmy Badenoch, and that's refreshing. And you say the Overton window, I think it has shifted. I think that, look at what has happened in Germany with the election of the new coalition government there, that there's some real sobriety creeping into their energy policy. We've seen the same with here in the U.S. with the election of Donald Trump. Now, was energy the key issue here in the U.S.? No, of course not. There were a lot of other factors. But now that Trump is in office, we see a complete shift in terms of energy policy. We're seeing somewhat similar moves in Canada. So I think internationally, there is more sobriety creeping into this whole discussion around energy and power and economics. Unfortunately, and your colleague Freddy Gray and I've talked about this, it doesn't seem to be really seeping in there in Britain. And you've seen just last September, the closure of your steelworks at Port Talbot. The last blast furnace in Britain was closed. Now one of the homes of the Industrial Revolution, you can't make virgin steel. I mean, it's indicative of a complete lack of understanding of the importance of energy to your economy.
And moving on from the public, the political leaders that have made these decisions, how do you think we got here? Is it like an environmental zealotry where we say, like, we don't care that we've destroyed industry, we don't care what this does to economic growth, we're just going to be so committed to environmental policies because we think that's the right thing? Or was there a naivety where they genuinely thought that you could transition to a green economy in a way that was going to create new jobs for all the jobs that were taken away?
I can't necessarily, assume to know what particularly the leaders of Labor and Keir Starmer have decided. But, I did talk with Freddie about the issue just last month. You had the big announcement of a massive gas discovery or resource in in Lincolnshire. 16 trillion cubic feet of recoverable gas, and the resource is even bigger than that. And so this is multiple years of potential. If you just were to rely on that one source of gas, could fuel Britain for years. And yet what is happening now? Instead of drilling for that gas and fracking, a Labor government spokesman said, oh, we're going to ban fracking forever. And we're going to go full bore on the clean energy, baloney, the alt energy silliness. I think it's a mix of naivete and some kind of weird idealism, but it's completely wrong-headed. And unfortunately for Britain, and I was in London last month, you're driving that your leadership is driving your economy into the ditch, and it's very dangerous for the long-term health of of Britain.
Do you think factors like this and what's happened at Heathrow last week are going to become, unavoidable? And are Britain's politicians going to change ways in the direction that America has?
Well, let's hope so. I mean, we can pray. I mean, let's do pray, because the global economy needs Britain. The U.S. needs Britain to be strong. And if your economy is only growing by 1%, it's essentially zero growth. Right. So, and your industrial base is crumbling, right? Whether now, the next industry to fall is likely to be automotive, but you also had the closure of the last synthetic ethanol plant in the UK, which closed, the Grangemouth plant closed in January. So these are very worrisome signs. But if I could, Michael, just shift back to one other quick point, going back to the issues at Heathrow and electricity, because this ties in with these claims around net zero, is that the recovery of that substation at Heathrow won't be quick. Now, they've been able to reroute electricity into the airport, and that's, their, linemen and electrical systems are, they can make these things happen. But one of the critical supply chain issues now that's facing the UK and the rest of the world is availability of these high powered transformers and the vulnerability of the electric grid to their sabotage or failure. And so, there have been press reports that this type of transformer, the wait time could be a year. It could be as many as 4 years. I was in Houston earlier this month for the CERAWeek conference, one of the biggest energy conferences in the world. And for a lot of this high voltage, so whether it's switchgear, arresters, transformers, in many cases, the higher the voltage, the longer the lead times. And in some cases, it's up to 4 years now. And because of this global expansion of electric systems, the electric grids all over the world, and the supply chains simply aren't able to keep up with this demand. So it could be, a year, 2 years or more before that substation, I think it's at Hyde in Britain, is actually back in service.
And do you think that the aviation industry, because it's an older industry, is just not as resilient as some other sectors? There's a data center, I think it's the ARC data center, which apparently was using the same substation that Heathrow used. That was able to stay online the whole time because data centers, just can't afford to ever go offline. Do you think the aviation industry has got some way to catch up on this resilience point?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, and it's a very simple fix, Michael. I mean, all you have to do is get a big honking tank of diesel fuel and a bunch of generators. And the data center business, as you point out rightly, they've known this for years. They need 5 nines, 6 nines of reliability. The airports are critical infrastructure as well. So you mentioned as earlier, is this naive, is this bad management? Yes, I would argue that it is. Why didn't the airport have its own system where it could detach from the electric grid and be self-sufficient and operate on its own? And this isn't rocket science, or we joke here in Texas, rocket surgery. It's not complicated. You just need a bunch of big honking 1, 2 megawatt, 3 megawatt generators and a big tank of diesel fuel. And I think the load at Heathrow, it's in the tens of megawatts. That's easily solved. This didn't have to happen. And it did. And it should be yet another wake up call. One, for this net zero silliness. And I've just started going through the net zero plan, and I found it, as I mentioned, Catherine Porter, she's such a sharp reporter, and her blog on What Logic on this has been the definitive account on what happened and what, the problems there. But, this isn't difficult to deal with. This should not have happened had Heathrow been properly prepared.
And is this, lack of preparedness, this mismanagement, is this a British problem? I mean, would an American airport allow something like this to happen?
Well, a lot of and Catherine reported on this, a lot of big airports in the U.S. have their own systems, right? They can detach from the grid in case of a grid failure. So I'm not going to say the the U.S. has all of this solved. It doesn't. We have a whole lot of airports and a whole lot of critical infrastructure that's older, needs to be replaced. This is a worldwide problem. So, what I hope happens in the wake of this is that this is a real wake up call, not just for the transportation infrastructure and those systems in the UK, but more broadly for Britain, that you have a lot of now strategic vulnerabilities and they're getting worse. And a lot of this is being caused by this insane fixation on net zero. And it's an insane fixation because here's the home of the Industrial Revolution. You've closed your coal plants. You've made yourself almost completely dependent on, not completely, mostly dependent on imported natural gas. In fact, here's a quick fact for you. Nearly 20%, it's actually 18% of the gas in Britain is now coming from the United States. I'm a long way from you. I'm in Austin, Texas, but a lot of that 18% of the gas coming from the U.S. is coming from gas wells in Texas, and it's going all the way across the Atlantic to London to heat your homes. 1 out of every 5 molecules effectively that you're using to heat your water and heat your homes, et cetera, is coming from the United States. And it doesn't have to be that way if you had sensible energy policy.
If I can put you on the spot slightly and ask you to
Sure.
To gaze into your crystal ball, if you've got one. You mentioned that lots of infrastructure is aging, and we've got this resilience issue in Britain, clearly, as Heathrow's shown. What's the next thing we should worry about? What's the next thing that's going to fall offline and cause disruption to our country?
Wow. Well, I one of the things we talked about and just touched on was the possibility of sabotage, right? And this was one thing that I've written about this before. I wrote about it in I think my 5th book about the vulnerability of the electric grid. It was in 2013 that there was a substation in California. It was called the Metcalf substation, was attacked by saboteurs, and there were no arrests ever made. They shot something like 100 rounds of 7.62 rifle rounds into it, AK-47 size rifle rounds. No one was ever apprehended. So, we could say the Heathrow, the shutdown there was a black swan. Well, sabotage could be a black swan, or an extended period of extreme cold weather could also be deadly because you don't have enough natural gas to go around. So I think that, the things that would be top of mind for me if I were an emergency planner in Britain would be, how vulnerable is our critical infrastructure to sabotage, and what will happen if we face some extreme weather event, and are we prepared? Because those are the things that to me seem pretty obvious.
And finally, on how the government does respond to Heathrow and also the threats that you've just laid out there. A lot of the talk we've had about how this country gets growth is that we need to deregulate, we need to get rid of red tape. But the natural response to this would be, well, there's clearly not proper planning regulations in place to say that you need power resilience, you need energy resilience. Do you think that a regulatory response is sensible here, or do we still need to focus on this push for growth that says, let the market sort these things out, and let's not answer this with more red tape?
Well, it's going to have to be a combination of both, right? Government doesn't have enough money to make all of this happen. It's going to need private industry to step forward. And, I'm very fortunate in my career. I've met a lot of people. I know the company Egdon Resources. It's owned by a Dallas-based firm, Hayco Energy. They're ready to drill in Lincolnshire. They have the leases there it's called the Gainsborough Trough. You have enormous shale resources onshore in Britain that you could turn your gas situation around in a matter of a year or two, if you had the will to do it, if you had the political will to do it. The same goes for, ramping up drilling in the North Sea. So I think it's going to be both, Michael. You're going to have a regulatory response from the government, and Labor and Tories are going to have to agree that this is a national priority, and you have to get going, and you have to get going right damn now. But you're going to need the private sector and companies that are willing to take the risk. And there's going to be a lot of political risk because of all this, back and forth in Britain and the strength of the anti-hydrocarbon lobby. But You're going to need private capital and private industry, and you're going to need a forceful response from government to turn things around. And I sure hope you do.
That's it for this week. Do tune in next week for the Week Omnibus again. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You can do that by tapping the subscribe button below and tap the bell icon so that you never miss an episode. Join us again next week.